Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Blenkley. I work in the DFE's Early Years Qualifications Unit, leading on Early Years Qualifications Policy. I'm really pleased to be talking to you today about the experience-based route for early years staff. The experience-based route is now available as of the 3rd of March, and I'm going to spend this time explaining the policy to you and how it works in practice for settings and staff. So what is the experience-based route, or EBR? Well, essentially, this is a pathway for staff who don't currently hold a full and relevant level 3 or above qualification to work in the staff-child ratios at level 3. We know that there are so many skilled and talented people working in the early years sector who, for whatever reason, don't hold an approved early years level 3 qualification. EBR is a way to recognise those staff and give them the opportunity to work and put their skills to use at a higher level. Staff undertaking this route must have demonstrated that they already have relevant experience and some of the relevant skills to work at level 3, and they have to successfully complete a period of supervised practice at their setting in order to gain EBR status. EBR is really all about that supervised practice period where the candidate will develop and demonstrate the skills that they're currently missing from the early years educator level 3 criteria. To give a bit of background on this policy, we originally consulted on the introduction of an experience-based route back in 2023 as part of our wider EYFS regulatory consultation. This was in light of the previous government's announcement to expand childcare support, which meant that the sector would need to build its workforce, in particular, as we know, at level 3. We asked the sector if they agree with the introduction of this type of route that allows practitioners to meet any missing level 3 criteria and gain approval to work in the ratios at level 3. And 73% of respondents agreed with this proposal. And in our response to the consultation, we confirmed that we'd be going ahead with an experience-based route alongside other flexibilities to qualification requirements, such as the removal of the level 2 maths requirement for level 3 staff. In April 2024, we held a technical consultation seeking views on our proposed model for how the EBR would work. We then published our response to this consultation in January 2025, and as I say, as of March, the EBR is now available to eligible settings and eligible staff. But please note that staff holding EBR status won't be able to work in the level 3 ratios until the relevant changes are made to the EYFS. And we expect these changes to take place in September of this year, September 2025. So this slide sets out the EBR model, the decision-making model, the eligibility criteria, and the process requirements as per our consultation response. It's important to emphasise that decisions relating to EBR are made by the provider. That's expected to be the setting manager in most cases, who will make decisions around staff eligibility and the final outcome of a candidate's EBR process. To be eligible to undertake EBR, the candidate must hold an approved level 2 qualification or a non-full and relevant level 3 or above qualification, and they must have been working in early years or a related sector for at least 1 year. And the provider must have a good or outstanding Ofsted judgment to be able to offer the EBR to its staff. There are some exceptions to this particular requirement, which I'll explain further on in the presentation. On process requirements, I'll go into more detail on some of these further in, but just to flag that while these proposals generally received positive responses in our consultation, we did make one particular change. We increased the length of experience required by the decision maker to 2 years following consultation feedback. So, one of the key eligibility criteria for EBR is that a setting must have received an overall effectiveness judgment of good or outstanding in its most recent Ofsted inspection to offer the EBR to its staff. This is to give assurance that EBR is being offered by providers that we know offer a high quality of education and where safeguarding and leadership are effective. And establishing the provider's eligibility should be the first thing they do if they're considering making use of EBR. It's worth noting that EBR is an optional flexibility and providers aren't obliged to offer it to their staff even if they meet that Ofsted requirement. It's for the provider to determine if the EBR is right for their setting. And there may be cases where all eligibility requirements are met by the provider and its staff, but the provider doesn't feel this is the right progression route for their staff. With the change to Ofsted reporting for schools that came into effect last September, this eligibility requirement is slightly different for school-based nurseries, and it depends when that setting received their last inspection. So if the setting was inspected before September 2024, then the same requirement applies. They must have received a good or outstanding. If they were inspected after September 2024 under the new reporting system, they can offer EBR as long as they weren't placed into a formal category of concern requiring significant improvement or special measures. Should similar changes be applied to Ofsted reporting for PVIs in future, we'll keep this requirement under review and make any necessary changes in the guidance. If a setting has not yet been inspected by Ofsted, they can offer EBR, but when they receive their first inspection, those requirements then apply. If a setting is downgraded to below good while a member of their staff is going through the experience-based route, unfortunately, that member of staff cannot complete their supervised practice period at that setting. After establishing if the provider is eligible to offer EBR, they would then look at the eligibility of their staff. Staff eligibility is based on qualifications and experience. This is to ensure that only those with relevant skills and knowledge are able to progress to achieving EBR status and working at level 3. Staff might approach the provider, or the provider might raise this option with staff. Either way, if there's interest in this route, the provider would need to check the staff's eligibility. A candidate must hold either a full and relevant level 2 qualification, so one that is specific to early years and meets our early years level 2 practitioner criteria, or a level 3 or higher qualification that isn't full and relevant but is related to the care or education of children. To check if a level 2 qualification is full and relevant, providers can refer to the DfE's early years qualification list. You might also be aware of our new Check an Early Years qualification digital service that enables managers to much more easily check the approved status of qualifications, and I'll provide a link for that service at the end of this presentation. For level 3 qualifications, we advise that providers confirm the qualification level by referring to either the qualification certificate or Ofqual's database of registered qualifications. And then they should assess whether that qualification relates to the education or care of young children. In our EBR guidance, we recommend that relevant qualifications can include those relating to early years, teaching or play work, health and social care, or an undergraduate degree that relates to early years and childcare but isn't full and relevant. However, that's not an exhaustive list, and the provider might consider if the qualification included any practical experience of working with young children, and they might compare the qualification content against the level 3 criteria. Qualifications gained outside of England might also be suitable. If a provider does have a member of staff with an overseas qualification, they should refer to the DfE's Overseas Qualification Recognition Service, where they can get confirmation on the qualification level and the relevance to the level 2 or level 3 criteria. In terms of experience, staff must have worked with early years aged children in England for at least 1 year. That can be in an early year setting, or it can be in a related sector. So, for example, teaching, health and social care, nursing, play work, and counselling. It's for the provider to determine the suitability of that experience. And we recommend that this experience was gained over a continuous period, but that's not a requirement. However, any leave periods of over 4 weeks should not be included when considering the candidate's total experience. When considering a member of staff for EBR, it's also worth noting that additional requirements for working at level 3 do still apply. So a member of staff holding EBR status does still need a level 2 English qualification and a paediatric first aid certificate to be included in the ratios at level 3. So if you have an eligible candidate for EBR, it's worth checking if they meet those additional requirements, and if not, considering if they can be supported to gain those qualifications. Once it's been established that the setting and the staff member are both eligible, the provider must then carry out an initial assessment of the applicant's skills, knowledge, and experience. This is carried out on behalf of the provider by a nominated assessor. We'd usually expect this role to be filled by the setting manager, who is responsible for all EBR decision making, but there may be some cases where it's appropriate to nominate another senior member of staff to be the assessor. Whether it's the manager or otherwise carrying out this assessment, that individual must hold a full and relevant level 3 qualification, and they must have worked in an early years setting for at least 2 years. The candidate is assessed against the early years educator level 3 criteria, and the purpose of this initial assessment is twofold. Firstly, it provides assurance that their prior skills and knowledge match sufficiently with the skills and knowledge expected of a level 3 member of staff. The candidate must meet at least 50% of the criteria to be able to continue with EBR. Secondly, for those that meet that 50% benchmark, it indicates which skills and knowledge the candidate must develop over the course of their supervised practice period. It's for the provider to decide how best to approach this assessment for their staff, but the DfE has provided a template that can be used to record which criteria are met and what evidence they have to support that decision. This template can be found on gov.uk alongside the EBR non-statutory guidance. And just to illustrate, this is a screenshot of that template, which can be found on gov.uk. Assuming the candidate meets the eligibility criteria and 50% of the level 3 criteria in their initial assessment, they can then begin their supervised practice period. And this is the core component of the experience-based route. All candidates must complete this period, even if they met 100% of the criteria in their initial assessment. During the supervised practice period, the candidate will continue to work at their setting, carrying out tasks and duties that let them develop and demonstrate the skills and knowledge that were missing from their initial assessment. Some of these might be their regular duties, but then they might also be given additional responsibilities to stretch and challenge them. So tasks can include educating and caring for young children, acting as a key person, supporting the assessment of children's progress, and carrying out administrative tasks. The supervised practice period should last between 751 to 900 hours. This is the minimum length of time the experience-based route should take. If a candidate who works full-time does the minimum length required, that would be around 6 months before they could progress to completing their experience-based route. The provider has discretion within this time frame. Some candidates might not need the full 900 hours, others might need more, in which case the provider can choose to extend the period until the candidate is ready. The types of tasks I've already mentioned can all contribute towards these hours, but CPD activities can too. So any courses, L&D the candidate carries out, or shadowing senior colleagues, these can all be logged and contribute towards the final assessment. A couple of points to emphasise. Firstly, the candidate does not need to be directly observed throughout this period. There will be a nominated supervisor who will provide support and monitor progress against the level 3 criteria across that period, but they don't need to be with the candidate at all times. But they should have regular check-ins with the candidate, provide any mentoring or coaching needed, and document the candidate's progress. Secondly, the candidate should not be included in the ratios at level 3 during their supervised practice period. Only after they've successfully completed their experience-based route can they work in the level 3 ratios. Once the candidate has completed the required hours and the provider believes they're ready, they can agree to finish the supervised practice period and move to the final assessment. This is a similar process to the initial assessment, and the same assessment template can be used. As with the initial assessment, this should also be carried out by the nominated assessor, who is responsible for assessing all of the evidence documented throughout the supervised practice period against the level 3 criteria. The final assessment takes into account all of the skills and knowledge demonstrated by the candidate during both their initial assessment and the recorded hours in their supervised practice period. If the candidate is assessed to have met 100% of the level 3 criteria, they have successfully completed their experience-based route and they gain experience-based route status. It's for the provider to decide how the assessment and its outcome are documented, but there should be some record that acts as evidence that the candidate has gained EBR status. They may wish to use the assessment template provided by the DFE and keep a copy of that in their records. If the candidate does not meet 100% of the criteria, then they do not gain EBR status. An unsuccessful outcome should also be recorded. The candidate should discuss next steps with their employer. This might be a continuation of the supervised practice period, or they might consider other routes to progression, for example, the early years educator apprenticeship or a full and relevant level 3 qualification. Assuming the candidate has been successful and now holds EBR status, they are eligible to be included in the staff-child ratios at level 3 for that provider, and they can carry out all of the duties that might be carried out by an educator that holds a full and relevant level 3 qualification. This is also assuming they meet all other requirements. As mentioned earlier, the educator must also hold a level 2 English qualification and a valid paediatric first aid certificate as per EYFS requirements. As mentioned, EBR status holders will only be able to work in the level 3 ratios once the relevant changes to the EYFS have been made, which is expected in September. Also, an educator holding EBR status cannot fill the role of manager. The EYFS requirement still applies that a manager must hold a full and relevant level 3 qualification. I've noted a couple of other requirements in this slide that providers should consider when deploying EBR staff. DFE is committed to developing the qualified workforce, and we want as many educators as possible to gain full and relevant qualifications. So there is absolutely still that need for fully qualified staff. So we've limited the use of EBR. So no more than 50% of staff working in the level 3 ratios in a setting can do so on the basis of EBR at one time. The remaining staff working at that level must hold a full and relevant qualification. And as a reminder, the staff-child ratios apply across the whole setting rather than per each individual room. And then we've also said that EBR status is not automatically transferable between providers. I've mentioned that it's for the provider to decide if they want to make use of EBR. So an incoming member of staff who holds EBR status can't assume that their new employer will want to make use of it. It's for that new provider to decide if they want to recognise that educator's EBR status and include them in the level 3 ratios. If they do want to include that educator at level 3, they don't have to do a new supervised practice period, but they must carry out a new assessment to gain assurance for themselves that the educator is meeting all of the level 3 criteria, so demonstrating all of those skills and knowledge. They may decide that their new member of staff should work for 1 or 2 months at their setting before carrying out their assessment. We do recognise that providers with more than one setting often move their staff around. So when an educator is moving from one setting to another under the same provider, that EBR status does go with them and can be used in all settings within that provider. These are 2 hypothetical examples of early years educators undertaking the experience-based route. So Olivia has worked in a private nursery for 1 year. She has a DFE approved early years practitioner level 2 qualification and has been working in the staff child ratios at level 2. She's interested in the EBR and talks to her manager about starting the process. Her manager does an initial assessment and she meets 62% of the level 3 criteria. She starts the supervised practice period to gain experience against the missing criteria. And after 6 months, Olivia has completed 900 hours of supervised practice. She decides with her manager to take the final assessment, and she is assessed as meeting 95% of the criteria and so can't be granted EBR status. She continues the supervised practice period for a further 2 weeks to meet the remaining 5%. Her manager then reassesses her. This time Olivia meets 100% of the criteria and gains EBR status to be included in the ratios at level 3. And then we have Mark, who has worked in a nursery in a maintained school for 2 years. He has a degree in early years that is not approved by the DFE and has been working as an unqualified member of staff. He wants to go through EBR. His manager agrees and carries out an assessment. And in that initial assessment, Mark meets 74% of the criteria. He starts the supervised practice period to meet the remaining criteria and completes 850 hours of supervised practice. When they go to assessment, Mark meets 100% of the criteria and is granted EBR status to work in the ratios at level 3 at his provider. Later on, Mark gets a new job with a different early years provider. When he moves employer, he shares evidence of his EBR status at the nursery he was assessed in. His new manager assesses him again after he has worked there for a month. He meets 100% of the criteria and is granted EBR status to work at level 3 in his new job. So, as I said, EBR is now available, meaning that providers can start identifying eligible staff, carrying out initial assessments, and beginning periods of supervised practice. However, it's important to re-emphasize that staff holding EBR status will not be able to count in the level 3 ratios until the DfE makes the required changes to the EYFS. We expect this to take place in September of this year. So anyone starting their EBR today and taking the minimum amount of time to complete it will gain EBR status once those changes have been made. And as we mentioned in our consultation response, we've now started working with awarding organisations to discuss options for assessment-only qualifications. EBR doesn't grant a qualification, and we see assessment-only qualifications as a way for EBR status holders to become fully qualified through external assessment. So this is something to look out for in the future. I've added some useful links to this slide, including a link to the consultation response, to the non-statutory guidance on EBR on gov.uk, to our contact DfE form, and also to the new Check and Early Years Qualification digital service. Foundation Years kindly sent out a survey to hear some of the more frequent questions about EBR, and we've brought these together into some overarching questions, which I'll move on to addressing now. So firstly, one question was, my school or early years provider was rated as requires improvement for overall effectiveness at its most recent Ofsted inspection. Can I start the EBR for staff so they could be included if we later on receive a judgment of good or outstanding at our next inspection? So the answer to that is no. To be eligible to offer the experience-based route at your setting, it must meet the eligibility criteria and be rated as good or outstanding at its most recent Ofsted inspection. EBR status must be gained in an eligible setting that meets the Ofsted judgment eligibility criterion throughout the time of the applicant's initial assessment, supervised practice period, and final assessment. If a staff member has been through the route and attained the status while the provider met the eligibility criteria, but then the setting subsequently receives a downgraded judgment below good, then it is possible for that staff member to keep using EBR status to work at level 3. It would be at the manager's discretion if they continue to do so, depending on the outcome of the Ofsted inspection and if they still deem it appropriate for the children in their care and their staff. And the second question was, what type of evidence is needed for the experience-based route, and how can this be used for an initial and final assessment? So when a member of staff is going through the experience-based route process, the provider should record evidence of the assessments that have been made and how the early years educator criteria have been met by an applicant. Evidence can include examples of specific observed behaviours or demonstrated knowledge that match a level 3 criterion. And evidence can be gathered from multiple sources, including professional and informal discussions with the applicants, where they demonstrate or provide examples of when they have met the criteria. It can come from observation of the applicant at work, or a review of training, CPD, and qualifications that have been undertaken by the applicant. Evidence can be gathered in different formats as appropriate. For example, assessors may wish to take notes in writing or record in an audio file professional discussions, but the assessment outcome should be recorded in writing. And as mentioned, DfE has provided a template for this purpose on gov.uk, where evidence can be recorded against each point of the criteria being assessed against. And then the next question was, can I be a room leader, deputy manager, or manager after I've completed the experience-based route? So it's a requirement in the EYFS framework that managers of early years settings have a full and relevant level 3 qualification. Applicants who've completed the experience-based route don't gain the full and relevant qualification and therefore cannot act as the manager of an early years setting on the basis of EBR status. There are no specified qualification requirements for deputy managers and room leaders, however, so it would be at the provider's discretion whether an EBR status holder can fill one of these roles. Applicants who've attained the EBR status may wish to attain a full and relevant qualification if they're thinking about progression in their career, progressing to manager. And then the next question, will the EBR be available to childminders? So EBR is available to staff in group and school-based early years settings only. The route allows for suitable staff who don't have a full and relevant level 3 qualification to be included in the ratios in those settings. The route is not available to childminders as the qualification requirements to be included in the staff child ratios don't apply to childminders. And then finally, what support is available to settings wishing to offer this route, and are there any external bodies that provide checks on this route? So EBR assessment decisions are at the discretion of the provider, or in practice, the manager. The Department for Education believes that providers are best placed to make these decisions as they know their children and their staff best. We published guidance on gov.uk to support providers, managers and applicants who wish to go through this process. The Ofsted inspection process will remain the same whether or not an early years provider chooses to offer the experience-based route to its staff. Inspectors will look at the early years provision offered in your setting and the safety and well-being of children. They won't request to look at EBR documents such as assessment documents that you've recorded for your staff that have been through the process. Staff who have experience-based route status will be treated as any other member of staff would be during an Ofsted inspection. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions about the experience-based route, please do get in touch using the Contact Us DFE form. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.